Picture a room so small you could cross it in 3 steps. It sits on the bank of the Euphrates, in the east of what is now Turkey, and more than 5,000 years ago, it was buried under the burning ruins of a palace. Push down through the ash, past the collapsed roof and the scorched mud brick, and you find a bundle that someone hid in their final hours. 9 swords, 12 spearheads, a few of them with hilts inlaid with thin, careful threads of silver. These are the oldest metal swords ever found anywhere on Earth, and they mark an exact moment in human history, the moment the knife grew up. A knife is a tool. You cut a rope with it, you skin an animal, you eat. A sword does one thing and one thing only. It reaches out and ends another person. So somewhere in that little room, on that riverbank, cutting became killing, and killing became a profession. And that silver on the hilts is whispering something even darker, because silver means somebody important, somebody who owned the metal and the men who carried it. A brand new kind of human had just been invented. Not a farmer, not a hunter, a warrior with a master, and a ruling class whose entire power flowed out of one alloy. This is where the modern world quietly begins. And the strangest part is that we never actually left. We took the whole of human prehistory, hundreds of thousands of years of it, and we chopped it into 3 neat chapters, and we named them after rocks and metal: the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. Stop and sit with that for a second. A full third of the human story is named after a single alloy. It was a Danish museum curator in the 1800s who first sorted history into those 3 drawers. And the way it gets taught, it sounds like a staircase. Stone on the bottom, crude and primitive. Bronze in the middle, a step up. Iron on top, the best. With us clever moderns standing proudly above the lot, humanity climbing, rung by rung, ever upward. Hold on to that picture, because that staircase is a lie. And by the time we are done, you are going to see that we never climbed off the bronze step at all. So why is bronze even special? Here's the beautiful part. Bronze is harder than the copper it is mostly made of, and it is harder because of a flaw. You take soft copper, whose atoms sit in a tidy, repeating grid, and you stir in a little tin. But tin atoms are slightly too big. They do not fit. They jam into that neat lattice like cars wedged bumper to bumper in a traffic jam that never moves. And suddenly, nothing can slide. The metal cannot bend, cannot dull, cannot give. Its strength, the strength that armed the first empires, comes entirely from an imperfection. Remember that, because imperfection is the whole story of this metal, right down to the end. But the very first bronze came with a curse baked into it. The earliest recipe was not copper and tin at all. It was copper and arsenic. And when you roast arsenic-rich ore over an open fire, hour after hour, year after year, it releases an invisible, tasteless poison that goes straight down into the lungs of whoever is leaning over the furnace. It does not kill you that day. It waits. It builds up in the body slowly, and then it starts taking that body apart from the inside. The nerves stop working, the muscles wither, the hands and feet go numb and weak, the skin breaks out in sores, and the person begins to walk with a heavy, dragging limp. The metalworkers of the Bronze Age were almost certainly the first people in all of history to be poisoned in bulk by their own jobs. And now, here is the detail that should put a chill straight up your spine. The ancient Greeks had a whole crowd of gods, and exactly one of them worked as a blacksmith: Hephaestus, god of the forge, god of fire. Every other Olympian is flawless, beautiful, glowing. He is the single disabled god in the entire roster. Withered legs, a twisted foot, a permanent limp, and a nickname that translates to something like the Sooty One. For a long time, people assumed that was just a quirky myth. Scholars now think it is something far more haunting. It is a memory, generation after generation of real, living smiths, slowly crippled by the metal they made, remembered by everyone around them, and finally turned into a limping god who looked exactly like the men hunched over the fire. Now for the part that quietly rewired the entire planet. Copper was easy. Copper turns up all over the place, and any decent kingdom could dig its own. But tin, that magic second ingredient, the thing that turned soft copper into a weapon, was viciously rare. It sat in only a tiny handful of spots on the whole of Earth, and that is the trap. Every king wanted bronze. Every army needed bronze, which meant every single one of them needed tin that they could not pull out of their own ground. So little isolated kingdoms were forced to do something nobody had ever really done before. They reached out, across deserts and seas and mountains, to total strangers on the far side of the known world, just to get their hands on it. And by doing that, almost by accident, human beings invented the first real international trade network. We are not guessing about this. In Turkey, archaeologists pulled up the actual paperwork of these ancient businessmen. more than 23,000 clay tablets covered in records, Assyrian merchants running donkey caravans loaded with tin and fine cloth, keeping careful accounts, signing what were basically joint investment partnerships, suing each other over unpaid debts, filing their taxes, and on one of those tablets, a merchant firing off a furious letter to his own brothers about a family money fight that had clearly been dragging on for ages. That is not some quaint ancient barter. That is ruthless, recognizable capitalism 4,000 years ago, and every bit of it existed to move one rare metal from one end of the world to the other. And then there is the single object that proves the whole thing in one breathtaking snapshot. Around 1,300 years before Christ, one merchant ship went down off the southern coast of Turkey. When divers finally found it more than 3,000 years later, it was not a wreck so much as a sealed time capsule of that first global economy, packed into one wooden hull. Start with the metal: 10 tons of copper, mined on the island of Cyprus, a full ton of tin. And here is the jaw dropper. Roughly a third of that tin had come all the way from what is now Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, deep in Central Asia. Picture it: herders out on the steppe breaking rock with stone hammers, and that tin then dragged thousands of miles overland, hauled to the coast, loaded onto a ship, and sailed off toward Greece. And the metal was only the beginning. The same vessel was carrying glass ingots from Egypt, ebony wood from Africa, elephant ivory, hippopotamus teeth, ostrich, eggshells, and amber that had traveled all the way down from the cold Baltic Sea in the north. One ship, 10 different corners of the ancient world, all crammed into its belly. And the copper and the tin were stowed in almost exactly the 10-to-1 ratio you need to cast them into bronze. This was not a guy sailing around swapping trinkets. This was a globalized, intercontinental supply chain 33 centuries ago. Hold on to that ship. We are going to come back to it, and when we do, it is going to mean something very different. All of that metal armed the first true superpowers, and it completely rewrote the way human beings kill each other. The largest chariot battle ever fought anywhere in the entire history of the species, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 chariots thundering at each other, happened at a place called Kadesh, between the Egyptian Empire and the Hittite Empire. It was so enormous, and so brutally even, that it ground to a halt and produced the first written peace treaty the world has ever seen. The Egyptians swung a weapon called the kopesh, a bronze blade curved like a sickle, with a wicked inner hook you could use to catch the rim of an enemy's shield and rip it clean out of his grip. And the armor got almost absurd. There is a full suit of bronze plate that came out of the ground near Mycenae in Greece, and for decades the experts swore it had to be ceremonial, far too heavy and stiff for any real soldier to actually fight in. It just sat there as a museum curiosity until the year 2024, when a team built exact replicas, strapped them onto real, serving Greek Marines, and ran them through an 11-hour mock battle staged straight out of the fighting described in Homer's Iliad. It held up perfectly. It turned out the thing was not a costume at all. It was a working combat exoskeleton, more than 3,000 years old, and we had been laughing at it the whole time. And this same obsession with bronze was erupting completely independently all over the planet in ways that get genuinely strange. In China, a lost kingdom we now call Sanqingdui buried whole pits full of giant bronze masks, with cylindrical eyes bulging straight out of their sockets and ears spread wide like wings, so alien-looking that people to this day cook up theories that aliens must have had a hand in them. In a Danish peat bog, a farmer plowing his field turned up a tiny bronze horse, pulling a golden sun on little wheels, a 3,000-year-old model of exactly how those people pictured the sun being hauled across the sky each day. And in Peru, craftsmen churned out thousands of small eye-shaped sheets of bronze and tied them into tidy bundles, not as tools, but as money, some of the oldest currency in all of the Americas, with 20,000 of them stuffed into a single rich man's tomb. Alien gods, golden calendars, and cold hard cash on 3 separate continents whose people had never once laid eyes on each other. Then the Greeks pushed this one metal to 2 opposite, almost unbelievable extremes. On one end, pure monstrous size, the Colossus of Rhodes, a bronze giant, 110 feet tall, looming over a harbor. And get this, it was cast from the abandoned siege engines of an enemy army that had tried to conquer the island and lost. The giant stood for just 54 years before an earthquake snapped it off at the knees. And centuries later, the scrap was supposedly so vast, it took 900 camels to carry it all away. And on the exact opposite end, microscopic precision. The Antikythera mechanism, a bronze device the size of a shoebox, pulled out of of yet another shipwreck, stuffed with 37 tiny interlocking gears. It was a hand-cranked computer, 2,000 years old, that could predict eclipses, track the sun and moon and planets, and even tell you the date of the next Olympic Games. Nothing else that mechanically complex would be built by human hands for another 1,400 years. We made it, and then we forgot we ever could. And then, all of it died. Around 1,200 years before Christ, in the span of a single human lifetime, nearly every great city from Greece to Gaza was burned to the ground or simply emptied out and abandoned. Historians still argue about why. There was drought, there was famine, there were earthquakes, and there were waves of mysterious sea raiders crashing into the coastlines and torching everything. But the real assassin of that entire glittering world was not the fire or the raiders. It was the supply chain. Remember, this whole dazzling civilization was balanced on one thin thread: the long-distance trade in rare tin. So when the raiders smashed the coastal trading hubs, those impossibly long routes reaching back into Central Asia were cut clean through. And no tin means no bronze. No bronze means no swords, no spears, no armor, no army. The great powers were quietly strangled of their metal, and one after another, they fell. Now, here comes the reversal that flips this entire story on its head. When the smoke cleared, people switched over to iron, and every one of us has been taught, since we were children, that this was the next great leap, humanity stepping up to a better metal. It was not. Early iron was actually worse than bronze. Brittle, ugly, much harder to forge properly. People did not switch to iron because it was better. They switched because iron ore is sitting in the dirt almost everywhere, which meant any little village could dig it up and bang out a blade without depending on a fragile global trade network that had just collapsed in flames. So the Iron Age, that chapter we proudly file away as humanity climbing one rung higher up the staircase, was actually a desperate downgrade. People reached for a worse metal for one simple reason: they could no longer get the better one. The great leap forward was a retreat. So here's the thing that almost nobody ever stops to notice. You picture the Bronze Age as ancient, finished, primitive, a chapter the human race climbed out of and left behind thousands of years ago. It is not finished. Look at what is actually in your hand right now: your phone, your laptop, the electric car charging in the driveway, the artificial intelligence you were chatting with this morning. Every single one of those runs on copper and tin, the exact same two metals. And the tin is still rare, still buried in only a few faraway corners of the world, still moving through supply chains thousands of miles long, every bit as fragile as the one that ran through that sunken ship off the coast of Turkey. And that fragility came roaring straight back in 2026, the way it always eventually does. A couple of mines stumble, in Myanmar and in Indonesia, and overnight the price of tin spikes to a multi-year high, and the entire electronics industry starts to sweat, because more than half of all the tin we now dig out of the ground goes into the microscopic dots of solder holding our computer chips together. We never escaped the Bronze Age. We are, at this very moment, more dependent on bronze's two metals than any human beings who have ever lived. We built a whole civilization on copper and tin. We watched it collapse once, when the supply lines were severed, and then we quietly went and rebuilt the exact same dependency all over again, just with better branding. We do not call it bronze anymore. We call it technology, and the same dark thread runs the entire length of it. The first smiths were poisoned, making the metal that armed the ancient world, and right now the desperate global scramble to mine the copper and tin for our shiny green and digital future is leaving behind the very same trail of broken bodies and stolen land. 5,000 years apart, the same two metals, the same human cost. So the next time something ordinary is sitting there in your hand, a coin, a wire, a spoon, stop and ask what it truly cost to put it there, and how many empires rose and burned to deliver it to you. If this flipped the way you see the metal sitting in your hand, do me one quick favor. Hit that like button, tell me in the comments which everyday object you want me to crack open next, and subscribe so you are here when I do.